Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back from lunch. It was quick, but we want to keep things moving. We've had a wonderful array of speakers already today, and Dr. McGinty's work was very much our pivot point as we go from talking about some of the psychological and mental health aspects of this, and we transition to talk about the media factors. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce to you Mr. Mark Follman. Mark Follman is the national editor of Mother Jones magazine. He's been covering gun violence and the broader policy issues related to gun violence in the United States for many years. His writing on gun laws and mass shootings have received multiple awards, including the ISI, the Society of Professional Journalists Award, and the Online News Association's Journalism Award for Explanatory Journalism. Not only does he cover these issues, but he's also done something that, as a mental health professional we like, which he's gotten a little bit meta. So he's not just reporting on the journalism, on the events, but he's reporting on the journalism itself and the role and the impact that journalism may have on subsequent events. So it's my honor and pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Mark Follman. Mark.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. An honor to speak among this great group of speakers and to be with you all today. Thanks to Jack and Lisa for putting this together. It's an area of focus that's of great interest to me. And today I want to talk a little bit about some of my work on the subject matter of mass shootings over the last few years. I'm going to talk some about the way that the media shapes public perception of the problem. And then also how media itself can actually affect the problem, as has already been discussed a little bit this morning. This is going to include some evidence from cases, looking at the trail of evidence. Some people were asking about this earlier. How do we know that the media influences mass shooters? And I'm going to show you some examples of that. I do want to note that this presentation does have some images in it that some people may find disturbing. There's nothing particularly graphic, but I just wanted to give a heads up on that. So I thought I'd start just with a very brief bit of background about how I got into focusing so much on mass shootings in my work. We've had a lot of these happening in recent years, and there has been an increase, we now know, in these events, going back to roughly 2011, depending on how you measure it. The attack that really focused my attention for going deep on investigations with this subject matter was in 2012, the movie theater massacre in Aurora, Colorado. If you recall, the scope of that event at the time was pretty extraordinary. There were 70 casualties in addition to 12 who were murdered in that movie theater. And for me, this provoked some kind of fundamental questions about the problem. How much is this happening? Is it happening more often? People seem to be starting to think that in terms of attacks that had happened in recent years. Who's doing these crimes that we keep seeing? How are they doing them? What kinds of weapons and tactics? All the sort of forensic questions you would ask to understand a problem. Came to a pretty shocking discovery the morning after this attack when I went looking for information about mass shootings. There's virtually nothing comprehensive in the public sphere. And there's a whole other story here about how the politics of gun regulations has really suppressed research into gun violence over the last several decades. I think many of you in this room are aware of that in general terms. I'm not going to get into that today, but the upshot was that there really was nothing available to answer the questions that I was asking. In discussion with some of my colleagues at Mother Jones, we decided we would build a database of public mass shootings going back 30 years from the date of the Aurora attack. And the initial challenge with the project was developing criteria for this because we discovered pretty quickly that there isn't really any official definition of a mass shooting. This is now subject of a much more robust debate. What is a mass shooting? And I'll get into that a little bit more later. But the way that we established the project was to look at some FBI research from a decade prior, where they'd done a symposium on mass murder that provided some good direction on this. That's where the commonly used metric of 4 or more people killed comes from, and had become essentially the accepted metric for criminologists studying the problem. We spoke with some criminologists and law enforcement folks and settled on that. It was also important to me to focus on this particular type of attack that we had just seen again in Aurora, where the perpetrator of the crime seemed to be acting indiscriminately in terms of killing. And that made it important to kind of rule out other types of mass casualty attacks with guns that stem from more conventional motives, so to speak. Armed robbery, bank robbery, gang, turf wars, those kinds of things that are understood in more kind of conventional terms. I think, in a sense, the most pressing and fundamental question that comes up for the public after one of these attacks is, why did this happen? And to try to understand that, you're talking about the question of motive. So really focusing in on this type of case was the goal. So we did exclude these other types of attacks that involved those types of motives. Published the first version of the database in 2012, in July 2012, at the time that we had 62 cases, going back 30 years, and with kind of grim regularity have been updating this ever since. As you can see, it's a truly national problem. It's urban and rural. You can see how this map now accounts for Las Vegas, which by an order of magnitude in terms of casualties was a different attack. Some of the major findings very quickly from our initial analysis with this project, that we did find that in public attacks with seemingly indiscriminate killing, that these types of cases had been on the rise, that they've essentially tripled in frequency in recent years. And this was subsequently confirmed through research by some researchers at the Harvard School of Public Health who analyzed our data. And then another study that came out shortly thereafter from the FBI with Texas State University, looking at active shooters, a little bit different data set, but actually contained the exact same data set that we were working with as a subset of this project. Similar conclusion in terms of the increased frequency of attacks. Another major finding was that most of the attackers used legally obtained firearms. It was more than 80% at the time we published the database, and that has remained the case. It's fallen, I think, slightly since then, but it's the overwhelming majority of cases. And also saw a strong correlation with mental health issues, which, as you heard this morning, is a really important and complicated aspect of this problem, because it does come up in a number of cases. And there are questions about how you define mental health problems, and also the public penchant for thinking of it as cause, when really there's no evidence that it causes this, but it's present in a lot of these cases. More than half of the initial data set of 62 cases were cases that ended in suicide, which is a very strong signal of something. So that called for further investigation. And I wanted to put this slide up too, because this is back in 2012, and you can see the kind of imagery we were using at the time on the story, which is common in the media. And as I got further into this subject matter over the years, I started becoming much more aware of the media's role in how it covers the subject and what implications that might have. And as Jack mentioned, started reporting on that to some degree too, as I began to learn about evidence and cases of the way in which the media was influencing some of these attackers. And this became one of a number of angles that I started reporting on, the so-called copycat problem. There's quite a bit of evidence, I think, more than the public knew at the time. Maybe it's more understood now. But in talking with people in law enforcement and mental health and in the field of threat assessment, as I started to get to know that, hearing about a lot of cases where there was evidence of this problem. And nowhere is this more prominent than with the Columbine mass shooting. This has had a really enduring effect in the public imagination, and has continued to show up in a lot of cases, both attacks and thwarted cases, thwarted plots. So I did this investigation that we published in 2015, looking at all the cases we could find, primarily through open source media research, but also in some cases talking with investigators and consulting, looking at public record, government records. found 74 cases. As you can see, 53 of them were plots that were thwarted, and 21 of them were actual attacks where the perpetrators had specifically cited Columbine as a source of inspiration for them, in some cases as a source of tactics that they sought to emulate. And there were some really interesting and disturbing patterns in this data too. There were 13 cases where the perpetrators expressed their explicit desire to surpass the carnage that was achieved at Columbine, to outdo the body count. And this will figure a lot more into the media equation, as you'll see in a few minutes. There were a number of cases where people had come to Columbine High School from other states to seek inspiration before going back to their home state to commit an attack. And there were actually 2 that were carried out by these people. So there's this really interesting kind of virulent hold on the imagination that Columbine has had. And in my view, from all the research I've done and talking with various people in the field of security primarily, that the media does have a role in this because of the way that Columbine is constantly sort of recycled in media coverage, not just mentioned in context, but the images and headlines that are used around that infamous attack. And this is a continuing problem. One of the ways I've tracked this is with a Google alert, and I've gotten kind of used to it, but it's really sort of grim when you stand back and think about, like, I see multiple examples of this almost every week in my inbox where there are ongoing threats that are referencing the Columbine massacre. And often these are in school settings, not exclusively, and they continue to show some of those trends too that I talked about a minute ago, very specific ways of emulating, similar videos, wanting to attack on the anniversary. There are more than a dozen cases like that where that was the articulated goal. Some of these subjects are people who are kids who were not even born when Columbine happened at this point. It's an interesting measure of the problem. And these aren't cases where we're talking about like a high school kid text messaging a joke about Columbine. These are serious cases. I mean, that exists too, these kind of more peripheral indications, which I think if you talk to people in the field of threat assessment will say you need to take everything seriously. That's part of the paradigm. But in terms of tracking the presence of this problem, I've used a certain bar of seriousness, and I'm talking about cases like this where this is a recent case, I think it was just adjudicated actually a few weeks ago with significant prison time. And also notable because this is a female. There's a lot of myth about who does these kinds of attacks or who aspires to it, and the idea that it's all men isn't quite true. The majority is certainly men, but there are women who think about this and attempt to do it too. And as you can see, this was a serious plan. I mean, she had acquired the weapons for bomb making and firearms to carry this out. This is a recent case from last year, an attack that was carried out at a supermarket. No relationship to a school, and yet you can see the perpetrator was focused on Columbine. It's also an international problem. There are quite a few cases overseas where plotters and attackers have cited Columbine. This is a recent case in the south of France at a high school. In my research, I found, I think it was there were 9 cases in Germany since 1999 where plotters and attackers cited Columbine, including 3 attacks that were actually carried out at schools. So I started thinking more about, well, what is the role of the media in this, perpetuating this kind of legacy? And it's not just with Columbine. There are a number of high-profile cases that provoke this interest. Virginia Tech is another, Sandy Hook now. Fort Hood has some problems with this, where there have actually now been 2 mass shootings. So I began to investigate more how the media really plays into this. I was starting to hear more and more from people I was talking to about evidence in cases that perpetrators of this crime were actually looking to past attackers for inspiration and citing them, citing media coverage of them. Wanted to start with this image because when I saw this, you might recall this happened a little over a year ago, an assassination of the Russian ambassador in Turkey. It's a little different kind of a case, a political assassination. But this image, within hours, was on the front pages of every major news site. And that just really struck me in terms of what it says about the kind of public expectation now for the way we view graphic violence and the way that the media will just put it up quickly. Obviously, this was a highly newsworthy event, and it was an event that was attended by the press, so that's why we had images like this come out. But I just thought this said a lot about the kind of default MO of the news media in terms of showing graphic violence, and we see that with the mass shooting attacks across the country as well. The story that really got me going on this was in August 2015. A case mentioned earlier today, the Roanoke, Virginia attack, where an ex-TV journalist gunned down two of his former colleagues as they were doing a live broadcast on location, also filmed it on his own GoPro camera and then posted the footage to Twitter and Facebook as he fled the scene. At the time, it was dubbed the first social media murder. This seemed clearly like a bid to get attention in a new way, to sort of escalate the stakes of sensationalism. Evidence in and of itself that seeking to commit an ever more sensational attack is part of a motive in some of these cases. And then look at how the media responded to it. This New York Daily News cover, tabloid-style approach to crime is not an uncommon thing, but this drew a lot of outrage when it was put up. And I think for obvious reasons in terms of the way that it's portraying the victimization again. For me, I also found it really disturbing in the way that it showed the footage from the attacker exactly how he wanted it to be seen by the world. You're literally staring down the barrel of his gun with him as he kills. And he had written things online and sort of manifesto-like material suggesting that he was seeking infamy. There are a lot of cases where there is evidence of that. This was one of them. He cited previous attacks like Columbine and Virginia Tech, the attack in Charleston, South Carolina. So this is what he wanted, and the media gave it to him. Now, the Daily News is known for a very pro-gun control editorial stance, and their response to all the outcry was to say, look, we can't become inured to the horror of this, and we have to look at it in stark terms and confront it. And I understand that argument, but I don't know that they were aware of the possible risks associated with this as well. The people who look at this kind of coverage and may see it as a source of inspiration and a chance to gain infamy like this. And we know through forensic evidence and looking at a lot of past cases that is a significant factor. And as I was working on this story, in the aftermath of that, as we headed into fall, sure enough, we had another mass shooting, Roseburg, Oregon, at the community college there. And I think we saw this quote earlier today. This attacker specifically was talking about the Virginia case. He was expressing his admiration for what that perpetrator had done with social media to gain, as he called it, instant worldwide fame, on the lips of every person around the planet in one day. And then his image was all over the place. One of the things you see in the media coverage of this problem is this kind of default MO of instantly go to social media, grab whatever material is available about the suspect, and publish it. And so this was taken from his, I think, MySpace page. And if you look at the kind of image this is, again, this is the way that this person wants to be seen. Talk to forensic psychologists in the field of threat assessment, they'll tell you in very clear terms that this is something they're looking for specifically. So the type of image matters too, is one of the things that I've come to learn in studying this. You can see the image on the left, he's posing with his gun in a way, kind of tough guy, cool. There's a significant trail of evidence of this aspiration as well. So I wrote this story in 2015, talking about the way that the media seem to be implicated in this problem through case studies, and also got into some suggestions of ideas of what we might start to do to change that, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Just a few other examples. The tabloids are the worst offenders, I think, for obvious reasons, but this is another example of taking material straight off the guy's website and just putting it up in a very sensationalized way. If you think about this person and the crime he committed, would he have wanted to be seen this way on the cover of the New York Post? I think the answer is probably yes. Similar discussion around using videos and manifestos. When the Santa Barbara case took place, these videos were everywhere. His YouTube video diaries of his Day of Retribution manifesto, I think is what he called it. And I think, again, that the default way of doing this is to just put it all out without providing much context or analysis for the public. That tends to follow. But in my view, I've come to believe that it should be the other way around, that the press should be making choices about what material to publish and focus on based on much more deliberate thinking about what's of value in terms of the public interest and thinking about the problem, and not just putting out sensational material because everybody wants to see it and know about it right away. There's a very strong temptation to do that. In some cases, it might not serve at all. This is the case that Russ mentioned earlier today. I did a long story on this, spent some time in Kansas. This was the workplace shooting in rural Kansas in 2016. Again, another case of the media immediately rounding up whatever they could find on social media and putting it out, including this video, which appeared all over. I'm just going to play this as a short clip. Let's see if I do this right. For some reason, I don't know if this is going to work. Okay, well, it's about a 10-second clip of this person, Cedric Ford, who was the attacker in Kansas, firing his AK-47 into a field that he had posted himself on Facebook a few months before carrying out his attack. I'm not sure to this day what the argument would be for the value of publishing this widely, but it was, and I think it's another example of material that the perpetrator would have wanted to publicize, but that the media maybe should not have done. Similarly, with photos he had on his Facebook page, this attack was at his place of work, but it involved multiple carjacking attempts on the way there and shooting at cars and from cars. So in that context, photos of him driving around with his firearm may be relevant to explaining the investigation, but I never saw it framed that way. I mean, that was understood much later. And you can see, he too was doing these kind of tough guy poses. Some of the research into mass shooters shows that there tends to be a lot of cases where there's a kind of obsession with firearms and with military gear and what some in the field call a pseudo-commando ambition. And you can see that in a lot of cases, including here, where he's literally calling this kind of a sexy pose, right, on Facebook. Another example from last year. If you go back into some of the older cases in our data set, it's interesting, the media coverage is a little more muted in some of the news stories I found. This was a major school shooting in 1989 in California. This is back in 1984. You see there's not even an image. This is one of the biggest mass shootings in modern history in Southern California at a McDonald's. It's not to say that there wasn't sensationalism back then. There was. It's always been around. But I think it says something, too, about the media environment we live in now in terms of digital technology and how rapidly things move and how much more, in a sense, vivid things are because of access to images and video and sharing and all of these kind of new tools that we have. This case I included, as Russ mentioned this morning, this was kind of a seminal case in threat assessment, the stalking murder of Rebecca Schaefer, Hollywood actress in 1989, by Robert Bardo. And what's interesting about this in addition to the kind of sensationalism with which it's presented, is thinking about how he may have perceived this himself. And he's alive, he's in prison. I think if you went and asked him what he thought of this spread, he would probably say that he appreciates it. I mean, who has the power in this spread, the way that it's designed? The kind of menacing courtroom photo and the photo of the victim. I was also struck, I found, this is a magazine called Crime Beat magazine, which I'm not sure is still around, but when it came out in the early 90s, Entertainment Weekly wrote this little review of it, and I just thought this was so telling in terms of, what's at the crux of this matter in terms of the temptations for the media. A glossy monthly with the macabre allure of a highway accident. You'd like to look away, but you just can't. And so we see this problem playing itself out. Taking it back to the Columbine example, this is an interesting piece of journalism, and I think worthwhile, from 2016 that appeared in Vice Media, and it's focused on this kind of cultish following for these guys. But if you look at that headline and you look at the image, I think you can see how that really plays into this theme of the way of kind of glorifying the idea of who these people were and what kind of impact they've had on society and on culture. And we've seen this image many, many times over the years, including I've seen it in unrelated school shooting cases where they're simply referencing Columbine and they use this image again. And I think there's a real question there as to the value, if any, of doing that versus perpetuating the mythology that, as I showed you a little bit earlier, has this recurring significant problem in terms of the emulation by people who want to pursue this. More recently, I started looking at the issue of body counts. As you know, we've seen mass shootings become more deadly recently. And this is something that's been paid a lot of attention in the press. It is, I think, an important data point in its own right and worthy of investigation and attention, but it is also, I think, it has raised questions of proportionality. Las Vegas, as you saw on the map earlier on, by an order of magnitude in terms of the victims, got all kinds of hyperbolic treatment in the press. It's accurate. The question is, was it done in a way that also takes into consideration some of the issues that I'm raising? And then that was followed by the church massacre in Texas about a month later, which was the worst in Texas's own history. And between the two, provoked a lot of this kind of discussion and framing in the press. Filmmaker Michael Moore, whose documentary on Columbine is well known. And it kind of brought about this whole sort of scorekeeping mentality that I thought was interesting and troubling for reasons discussed. If you think about the idea that there's significant evidence that mass shooters want to outdo their predecessors. In the Columbine set alone, there were, I think I said 13 cases in that initial data set. Then you can imagine when they see this kind of coverage of the record, what that might provoke. This one actually brings the two streams together. You've got the scorekeeping headline and the old Columbine image. And part of the discussion was how Columbine was no longer in the top 10. And I should say, as a member of the media, I'm not doing this in a way that I hope it's not coming across as finger pointing. I think a big part of this is a lack of awareness in my field and in the general public about the effects that some of this can have that is collateral to the kind of the main focus of understanding the problem, which I believe is the intention of the coverage. I don't think it's purely to sensationalize it. I think it's done maybe with not as much thought and deliberation as it should be. This was interesting to me to see how pervasive this kind of scorekeeping became in this moment. Go to the Wikipedia page because the Texas case had brought up the fact that the UT Austin clock tower shooting in 1966, a very famous early mass shooting case, had been supplanted by the church shooting in Texas. last fall. So literally, within days, the Wikipedia page is taking note of this at the top of the page. This is now number 8 instead of whatever it was before. So I wrote a piece recently outlining some of this with the specific focus on the body count, and there's a history of this that goes way back too, literally coming out of the UT Austin case. You can see there was an attack in Arizona in 1966, 3 months after UT Austin, where the perpetrator who was taken into custody told investigators that he was inspired by what happened at UT Austin. It had gotten a lot of attention at the time, and said that that's what he wanted to do. The day before I published this piece, I'd been working on it for a little while, an uncanny fresh example comes along. Case in Ohio. This person was taken into custody by FBI, had threatened his estranged wife with death threats over text, had threatened to go shoot up the casino in Las Vegas where she worked. Also a church where they had, in the community where they'd lived together. So he was combining both examples and said that he wanted to do, quote, the biggest in history. It was a really sort of uncanny coming together of exactly what I was looking at. It was a strange moment. So I'm running a little short on time, so I'm going to just very quickly touch on the issue of defining mass shooting and how that debate has played out. You've seen a lot of headlines like this in the last few years, and I found myself in sort of an unlikely position of having been someone who was early on drawing more attention to the problem of mass shootings, having built the database, and now kind of pushing back on some of the mainstream coverage saying there's thousands of mass shootings a year, or hundreds or thousands, and really using a much more broadly defined data set that was started as a crowdsourcing project on social media, on Reddit. And this is problematic in my view because it gets away from focusing on the specific problem where we started. When you take into account those other kinds of crimes, gang violence, robbery, those are just as important, and they're more pervasive. I think it's more important to note that the types of indiscriminate public mass shootings that my project had focused on is very narrow. It's a very small fraction of the overall gun violence problem. But it's a distinct problem, and I think the narrow focus was important for trying to understand it better. That's what the public is seeking to do intensely after these happen. So this has become an interesting debate. I wrote about it at some length, and part of the reason that I was pushing back on it is because I think when you tell people that there are 1,000 mass shootings a year, it creates some fear in the public that's maybe not warranted. Because when you say mass shooting, what are you thinking of? You're thinking of Las Vegas, you're thinking of Sandy Hook, you're thinking of Columbine. You're not thinking of somebody robbed the 7-Eleven at 2 a.m. and shot a few people. Also a relevant, important crime, but a different kind of crime. And the result is you have people interviewed by this was around the time of San Bernardino, interviewed by the New York Times saying, I'm afraid to drop my kid off at the mall. I'm afraid to sit in a movie theater. I'm worried this is going to happen. When statistically speaking, the odds are extremely small that it's going to happen to you. The Times itself was literally asking this question on its front page after San Bernardino, and the answer was yes. I worry about mass shootings because the press keeps saying in headlines there are hundreds and thousands of them. And it's also resulted in some interesting policy choices. There's been a lot more active shooter drills going on in schools. And I think to echo Russ's point, no one would argue against better preparedness when something goes wrong. But I'm not sure that people ask the question so much, what does it mean to have a teenager do an active shooter simulation drill like this at a time of relatively young, vulnerable psychological development? I mean, I think this is actually the most disturbing image in the deck, right? But I think that level of fear generated by the media is in part driving policy choices like this. And at least those are questions that I think should be asked. I will skip past this very quickly. I think Kelly will talk about this some next, but people who follow mass shootings coverage know that often, especially in the immediate aftermath, the media gets stuff wrong. It's not just the press. This is now a problem on social media too. As Las Vegas was unfolding, this is an Australian pop star with millions of followers on Twitter, and this is what she's tweeting. And I think part of the role of the media now is to help educate the public and correct when this happens. I was online when this was happening and saw this and responded this way because so often we hear, oh, there's multiple shooters on the loose, and think about the kind of public fear that induces. In most cases, in almost all cases, that's never what actually happened. So there's a whole new level of challenge for the media dealing with this in the immediate aftermath, and the kinds of pressures that are on reporters to respond and provide explanation and clarity to the public on the one hand, but on the other hand, to wait until we know what's happened. I think Kelly will talk about this some more too. So, journalists, I think, have an important role in this kind of immediate context too, where it's even more of a struggle now because of the technology we're dealing with. So very quickly, I'll just conclude with some of the suggestions I made back in 2015 in thinking about this from my research and talking with threat assessment experts and others, asking them what they would recommend the media do differently. I don't think that it's possible to get the media to not cover this, and I don't think that that would be the right thing to do. There's a great public interest in this problem. That said, I think there are ways we can start to think about not contributing to the copycat factor and reducing the level of sensationalism that may be done inadvertently, trying to really favor dispassionate language, not using the name any more than is necessary, repeating it over and over. The images are especially important, and especially the kinds of images I was showing you before, the kind of posed tough guy images that they want in terms of seeking infamy and desiring fame. They want to be seen that way. They want the world to look down their gun barrel with them. Don't do that. We don't need to do that to convey the story. What I said earlier about the manifestos and the videos, I don't think that it's realistic to say that stuff isn't going to be covered in the press, but I think that the press needs to be deliberate about how we frame it, how we emphasize it. And I've kind of updated my thinking about this and may write on it again based on what I've learned more recently, including with the issue of Columbine continuing on and on. I think the mythologizing of that case should end as much as possible, emphasizing record body counts. If that's a data point that we need to address in reporting, that's fine, but does it need to be in the headlines? I don't know. And I use this example, I think, very well handled by the hometown paper the day after. The numbers are right there in the subhead, but they're not in 50-point font, and it's not making the focus about breaking the record. And I think, and not showing the picture of the perpetrator either. I think this is a very effective way to handle the high drama and emotion of the first 24 hours of what had happened. And there's been a little progress on this front too. I think the conversation is happening in the media, and I see that as a real plus, because when I started focusing on this in 2015, it just was barely on the table. Some news organizations have started to say we're really going to start to try to change our behavior and be more deliberate about this. And there's a whole continuum of choices, and I think in some cases to some degree it's case by case. But if that thought process is going on in the media, that is a huge step forward in my view. And then most recently, this set of recommendations, I put this up as a tool for any journalists in the room. This is a good resource that was published in early 2017. Some further ideas that are in some ways very similar to what I was suggesting in 2015 and goes beyond also and relates to suicide prevention. And I'll leave it at that for now. Take any questions. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you for a wonderful and powerful presentation. Let's see. So would you recommend that others beyond journalists, like law enforcement, avoid revealing the perpetrator's name?
That's an interesting question. I think there is room for law enforcement in this equation too. I know that's been under discussion some in recent cases. There's an intense interest among the public to know who commits a crime, and I think validly so. It's part of our criminal justice process. But I think it's probably the same questions of proportionality. Once the information's out there, maybe with the initial confirmation of what happened, I could see value in other professional spheres, law enforcement, mental health, no longer perpetuating the repetition, because they're folks that are talking to the media too. And so if they're talking about it by constantly naming or sensationalizing in some way, if inadvertently, or pushing certain themes, then that's going to come through in the press as well.
And I'll note that with the Texas church shooting, the public information officer giving the briefings after the event actually did a very good job of explicitly saying, in deference and out of respect to the victims and knowing what we know about the risk of copycat events, we're going to minimize the use of the name. So they did a very good job of saying that. It seemed to have been absorbed reasonably well by at least some media outlets. All right. So do we know that being named as the Columbine shooters glorified the perpetrator significantly less than naming names? Might such titles also lead to copycat violence seeking publicity even if not attached to the perpetrator's name? So by giving it some other, eponym of the Vegas shooter, the church shooter, does that bring notoriety as well, do you think?
I wouldn't think so much. The act itself obviously is what is getting the notoriety fundamentally, but putting someone's name and images and lights that's what they seek most. And if you talk to experts in this, in the psychological side of it, the images are what they're most concerned about, typically. So I think there is a distinction there. Certainly the public is still going to know about the event. It still matters, but I do think it would blunt that effect some, particularly in terms of the images, especially the self-styled posing. Again, I think I can't emphasize that enough in terms of what I've seen in forensic trail of these cases. If you think about the photo of the Las Vegas attacker, it was a lot less memorable image. He was just some guy sort of smiling into the camera, and that may have been because that's just what was available. That might have been a more deliberate choice by the law enforcement and by the press. But look at the difference in effect between that and, say, the Aurora attacker who posed with his, red hair on the Joker image, or the guy from Roseburg whose Facebook photo with the shotgun was everywhere. I think there's a definite difference there in terms of the public recollection.
How do you think the media can educate and advocate everyone to enlighten people and individuals in a healthy manner when mass shootings occur, such as the Pulse nightclub shooting in Florida, appearing to target specific groups? How can the media educate about gun violence, but also about community-specific issues like the LGBTQIA?
That's a great question. I think part of the answer to that in the context of mass shootings and how much attention they get, there needs to be more attention from the media on the victims and survivors and the community. And I think there's actually been a real improvement in that in recent years, whereas maybe a few years ago around the time of Aurora and Sandy Hook, there was just so much intense focus on the attackers. And I think we've seen more now, the media being more willing to engage the community and to focus on the people affected by this. And there are a great many people, not just the people actually shot and the people closest to them, but that has a ripple effect. Some other reporting work I've done looking at that, you look at the impact in the community itself, it's profound, I think, for obvious reasons. And there's a lot more storytelling that can be done there. It's not easy to do. It's a very sensitive area to go into. But I think when it's done well, it's very valuable and can illuminate those kinds of questions more. And also, have sort of the positive effect of moving the attention off of the perpetrator.
Next question, and actually this is a wonderful question. Any research or thoughts on the impact of portraying victims' emergency evacuations or the aftermath in the media in regard to inspiring copycats? And I'll annotate quickly, as I do teaching and presentation about some of these events, I moved quite a while ago from images of the offender towards images of the first responders or images of memorial events. And now reading this card, I'm actually really a little concerned about what the answer might be.
So I'm sorry, I wasn't quite clear.
So any thoughts or is there any research about the impact of
I see, if it would
other types of images of the memorials or the
I don't know of anything like that anecdotally where pictures or attention on victims or first responders has actually been a tool of inspiration for an attack. That's an interesting question, though. But having not seen it in any other extensive research I've done and having not heard about it from anyone focused on this problem, I would guess that if it exists at all, it's a very small factor. So it wouldn't be in any way disqualifying to doing that kind of coverage, I would say.
Given the limitations imposed by the First Amendment on legislation around these types of issues, what steps can be taken and by whom to encourage newspapers and media about naming victims in sex crimes, about these types of events, and what lessons can be learned from that process? And how does that impact this topic?
Yeah, so I've found myself on both sides of this debate, so to speak, because when I first started writing about it, the piece I had in the New York Times in 2015, I was talking about how there is precedent for this, for ethical reporting guidelines on subjects like suicide, because we know there's a well-established research showing the contagion effect there. And there's this kind of ethical agreement in the profession, you don't publicize suicides. This has come up again very recently. I don't know if any of you saw the story in the Washington Post about Robin Williams and what that did. That new research is sort of a reminder. I feel like people maybe sort of forgot about that. And so here we are again. So on one side, you have that discussion, but I think on the other, you also have the imperative for the public to know about a type of crime that is of intense interest, and the media has a duty to respond to that in the public interest. And so for me, I've really kind of settled into a continuum of proportionality and deliberation. I don't think it's realistic, to raise it as a First Amendment issue. I don't think that's really relevant in the sense that you're not going to censor the speech. You're not going to have a blackout. The media is not going to do that. It's antithetical to the mission of reporting in the public interest. But there's a lot of continuum here to work with, I think, in terms of focus, emphasis, proportionality, and again, just being deliberate about what you do and not just default to circulating instantly and globally all this raw material, which is, I think, still largely the default.
Mark, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jack.
Yeah.
Great.